Hi, everyone. Let's talk about biased samples and biased questions. Feel free to read this here. I won't test you on this per se, but let's go to a fun polls handout. It's an old handout, but it's still fun. All right, polls. Issue 1, do people lie to pollsters? Yeah, they do. Sure, I go to church. In a telephone poll of Roman Catholics in one county in Ohio, 51% of respondents said they attended church in the week before the poll. Actually, only 24% did. And I hear that they do count. Pretending to be devout. Example 2. Are people now more honest in polls involving minority candidates? Because back in 1989, there were a couple of major victories by two African-American or black politicians, both Democrats, for New York City mayor and Virginia governor. In the polls, they were both leading by double digits, but they both won squeakers on election day. And this effect is sometimes called the Wilder effect after the Virginia governor-elect, or the Bradley effect after a gubernatorial candidate in California. So back in the 1980s, maybe people weren't so honest, and black candidates tended to overpoll. But Barack Obama did pretty much perform according to the polls in 2008, so perhaps we're not seeing this as much. But it has happened. In 2003, Bobby Jindal, an Indian-American Republican, underpolled and lost to the Democrat. So you wonder how honest people are when minority candidates are involved. Perhaps it has gotten better in terms of accuracy. Oh yeah, I voted for him. In 1992, Bill Clinton won 43% of the vote for president. But in a poll taken after the election, 50.4%, a majority of the respondents, claimed they voted for him. By the way, later on, we'll talk about these issues of whether that's statistically significant. Do we have evidence that they really lied, basically, in some sense? But I don't know, maybe people are afraid of the new president-elect. The hidden vote. In political circles, there's often talk of a hidden vote consisting of supporters of a controversial candidate. And actually, there is some speculation that there might be a hidden vote for President Trump. Issue 2, watch out for phone-in, mail-in, and log-in polls. Basically polls where you select yourself as a respondent. That's the problem of self-selection. In a self-selected sample, potential respondents themselves decide whether or not they were included in the sample. So who decides who's in the sample? You do, as the respondent. That's not good. We know that big samples in unscientific polls can be less accurate than small samples in scientific polls, because the big samples might involve unscientific polls that involve self-selection. Here's a big example. In fact, there were several problems with this kind of poll. The most famous Bosch poll in history. Famous. You find this in all stats books. In order to predict the outcome of the 1936 presidential election, the Literary Digest, doesn't sound familiar, huh? It's because they closed down after this ridiculous poll result. The Literary Digest mailed ballots to 10 million people. About a quarter of them, 2.4 million, responded. The Literary Digest claimed that the country will know to within a fraction of 1% the actual popular vote of 40 millions. Well, that might have been true if it were a scientifically selected sample, but it wasn't. First of all, what did the poll say? The poll said that Alf Landon, the Republican, would defeat the Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, by a solid 14% margin. Ever hear of President Alf Landon? There was none. He lost. In fact, he won 2 states, Vermont and Maine. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt won by a huge 24-point margin, one of the biggest margins in history. Massively botched poll. After the election, the Literary Digest had a cover that exclaimed, "Is our face red?" and soon went out of business. So what went wrong? Well, the non-response bias, the fact that only a quarter of the 10 million people responded. By the way, the Harris poll says the refusal rate is normally 20%. Here, the refusal rate was about 3/4. The census also has a problem with non-response. But it wasn't just that. It was also the problem of self-selection. The fact that people selected themselves to take part. So maybe enthusiasm was a part of it. Also, there's the problem of selection bias. How were the 10 million people selected? The ones who were given surveys. The list of 10 million potential respondents, the ones to whom ballots were mailed, were drawn up from phone books, magazine subscriptions, and club memberships. Things only wealthier people had. Now remember, this was in 1936. What was the country like in 1936? We were in the midst of the Great Depression, and you really had to be wealthy to have the luxury of having these things. Okay, even a phone, a club membership, right? The Gallup poll only polled 50,000 people, which is huge by today's standards, and at least they predicted that FDR would win. Beware of self-selection. Phone-in polls. 186,000 Nightline viewers paid 50 cents a piece to call a phone number to say whether or not the UN should stay in the United States. 67% of them wanted the UN out of the United States. But in a scientific poll, which I bet was closer to accurate, 72% of Americans wanted the UN to stay in the United States, even though it only had 500 respondents. Again, I'm guessing that was more accurate. It probably was. Beware of internet polls. The following quick vote internet poll posted at CNN in March 2001. Do you celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Of course, I'm Irish, 22%. Well, Irish Americans may have enthusiastically logged in. Irish Americans, and maybe some Irish citizens of Ireland, were probably overrepresented. Irish Americans only represent 7 to 8% of Americans. The 22% was an overrepresentation, unless you had a whole bunch of people from Ireland itself, perhaps. Beware of fans. Quick vote poll on CNN.com. They used to love these things. On January 24th, 2004, are you a Mac fan or a PC person? Mac fan, 20%. Probably an overestimate. Okay, Apple Computer makes Macs, and Apple's market share, at least at that time, was a paltry 3 to 5%. But it's a very committed 3 to 5%, including me. And by the way, this date, January 24th, 2004, it's a special date. It was the 20th anniversary of the Mac. So Mac fans were especially enthusiastic. This could be the world's dumbest poll question, the day before that. Do you vote? Yes, 95%. Come on. What's wrong with this? Bias towards people who tend to vote. Well, by definition, if you voted in this poll, you just voted. Okay, self-selection, all that jazz. If you self-selected, you voted. Okay, the poll is obviously biased towards regular voters, and it should have been yes, 100% by definition, really. Poorly worded questions. Should the death penalty not apply to the mentally retarded? What, huh? So if you tend to be anti-death penalty, how should you vote? It's hard to tell because it's almost like a double negative. If you want an accurate poll, you want to avoid double negatives and confusing poll questions. For example, people who oppose the death penalty would tend to say, yes, should the death penalty not apply to the mentally retarded or mentally disabled, they would tend to say yes. They're supposed to say yes if they're against the death penalty in general, but they might be confused. Okay, and these quick vote polls are worthless anyway. Self-selection. Wording a poll question in different ways. Sometimes order matters, sometimes it doesn't. A poll in Germany asked basically the same question in two different ways, presumably to different samples. Number one, would you say traffic contributes more or less to air pollution than industry? Or, number two, a second sample was asked, would you say industry contributes more or less to air pollution than traffic? Really the same question, but the two words here were switched. And yet, very different results. If traffic is mentioned first, it's declared to be more of a contributor to air pollution by a 21-point margin. If industry comes first in the wording, then it quote unquote wins by a 25-point margin. So order really mattered. This is probably the case if people don't really care. It's like, yeah, whatever you said first. They didn't really care. Here's my question to you. If we were asking an election poll and you ask a sample, are you for Trump versus Biden? And you ask another scientifically selected sample, are you for Biden versus Trump? Do you think that the order would really have a profound impact on the results? I don't think so, because people generally care if President Trump wins or if Joe Biden wins. Right. I use this word Trump. Strength of opinion may well trump order in major political races, though, like in Trump versus Biden. Now, in the 2003 recall election for governor of California, a lot of eyes were on Arnold Schwarzenegger. A lot of people were eager to vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger. But still, people were curious what order he would be on the ballot. About 250 people ran for governor in that recall election. And in order to be, quote unquote, fair, lettered balls were randomly selected from a rotating bin to help determine the order of names on the ballot. And everyone was waiting for S for Schwarzenegger when that would show up. So if you're really passionate about Arnold Schwarzenegger, it didn't matter if he was first or last, really. Leading or biased questions. In the 2000 presidential primaries, John McCain complained about push polling by the George W. Bush campaign in South Carolina. People were asked if they would vote for McCain if they knew he was mentally unstable, had a mixed-race child out of wedlock, and had an alcoholic wife. By the way, I'm not saying any of these was true. Now, some polls, even push polls, start with a clean question for informational purposes, because you might really want to know what the state of the race is. And then they test out various themes for the internal use of the campaign to see if one push topic would work in a campaign ad, for example, or if it might not work. And then at the end, you might ask, are you for this candidate or that candidate? And then see how the results change. Speaking of other push polls, or actually, maybe not so much a push poll, but the wording did matter. Okay, in one poll around 1996, when people were asked if they supported a flag-burning amendment to the Constitution, the percent that said support was in the high 70s. But if you add one more bit of information, if they were informed that it would be the First Amendment to limit or curtail the First Amendment to the Constitution, the percent support drops to the low 40s. And people actually cared about the flag-burning amendment back in 1996. I remember. Even though I was 1 year old. Just kidding. But yeah, even for an issue people care about, if you add additional information, that can have a dramatic impact on the results, the poll results. If you state the purpose, that could have a similar effect. Ross Perot, I'll talk about him later. He was a presidential candidate in 1996, independent. A mail-in survey conducted by the Ross Perot campaign asked, should the president have the line item veto to eliminate waste? They're stating the purpose of the line item veto. 97% said yes. But in a scientific poll, where the random sample, should the president have the line item veto or not? And by the way, this is not self-selected like the mail-in survey was. Should the president have the line item veto or not? Only 57% said yes, a 40-point drop. In fact, a lot of people might not know what a line item veto is, right? And they certainly weren't told that the purpose was to eliminate waste. By the way, the idea of a line item veto is the idea that the president could strike out certain parts of the budget and pass the budget overall without it. Would you say more likely to this push poll question? Please tell me if you would be more likely or less likely to vote for Roy Romer if you knew that Governor Romer appoints a parole board which has granted early release to an average of 4 convicted felons per day every day since Romer took office. Yeah, I think this was a push poll. This was a push poll to try to get people to vote against Romer. He later became school superintendent in Los Angeles. All right. Quick vote internet poll, one of these garbage vote-in polls at CNN.com on October 10th, 2001. Is Al-Qaeda sending coded messages to followers via video statements? 79% said yes. Look at that date, October 10th, 2001. I know some of you weren't born then, but think about it. What do you think the mood of the country was back then? I remember back then. That wasn't even a month after 9/11, that terrorist attack. So yeah, Al-Qaeda would have been accused of doing anything. Uh, Sending out video statements, kicking little puppies, you name it. Al-Qaeda was to blame for it all. The ending of Game of Thrones, if it had happened back then. I thought that was okay. Sensitive surveys. If we worry about getting honest answers to sensitive questions, such as sexuality or health, we could inject an element of randomness, such as a coin flip. For example, if I were to ask you, do you have coronavirus? If you have coronavirus, please say yes. But even if you don't have coronavirus, flip a coin. If the coin comes up yes, go ahead and say yes. I have coronavirus. And this is a way of sort of hiding things, so that if someone says that they have coronavirus, then it could be because they actually do have coronavirus, or it's because of the coin flip. So it's a way of covering up for things. And you can adjust the results based on the nature of the element of randomness, like the coin flip. You can adjust the results accordingly so that they're more accurate. Sampling error is natural. Even if the polling methodology is excellent, the sample results may lead you astray. Even well-designed polls are subject to sampling error, and sometimes you're just unlucky. I'll give you an example, all the way down here. Well, okay, well, I'll mention that. So bottom line is, if a poll says that a candidate is going to get 47% of the vote, and the candidate actually gets 46% of the vote, that could well be due to sampling error. We'll talk about that later in inference. In defense of polls. Okay, here's a mad letter by a corporation president to the AP. When you or anyone else attempts to tell me and my associates that 1,223 persons account for our opinions and tastes here in American, I get mad as hell. How dare you? When you or anyone else tells me that 1,223 people represent America, it is astounding and unfair and should be outlawed. Well, this person could be a corporation president, obviously did not take statistics or pass it. Because actually, regardless of the population size, as long as it's much bigger than the sample size, it doesn't matter what big N is. Little p, the underlying proportion of voters who say are going to vote for Trump, okay? It's an underlying proportion that's there, okay? And it doesn't matter what big N is. What matters is how large little n is. It doesn't matter how big N is, as long as it's a lot larger than little n. It doesn't matter how big N is. Okay, it's like little p is this reality, and you're trying to get at it. The bigger little n is, the more you're getting at it. The idea in statistics is that you're more likely to be accurate in terms of getting at what the value of p is. We'll talk about sampling methods and how they're used to estimate p later on, a proportion. Now, statisticians are irritated by the fact that polls don't mention that typically the confidence level is 95%. So, though it's rarely stated, and it should be. Okay, which means that if the margin of error is 3%, okay, that means that we're 95% confident that the actual result is within 3% of the stated result. For example, the Nielsen's, which deal with TV viewerships, handle 4,000 households, and the margin of error is less than 1% for 95% confidence. Okay, so that's the assumed confidence level, 95%. We'll talk about that later. And again, speaking of sampling error, sometimes even when we try our best, the polls are sometimes wrong. Famous headline, Dewey defeats Truman. Remember President Dewey? Like President Landon, there was none, okay? In the 1948 presidential election, the pre-election polls had New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the Republican, way ahead of incumbent Harry Truman. But in the end, Truman won. And this photo became famous. Truman here is smiling because he knew he actually won. Ha ha. Sometimes the polls are wrong, even when we try our best. All right, well, we're going to try to get it right in this class, but be humble. Until then.